Hey guys. According to a comprehensive University of Chicago report on gun trends in the United States between 1972 and 2014, the household ownership of firearms has declined in recent decades. 31% of households reported having a firearm in 2014. This is a decline of about 17% from peak ownership years in 1977 to 1980. Similarly, in 2010 and 2014, about 32% of adults lived in households having firearms. This was a decline almost 19% from an average of 51.2% in 1976 and 82. This data also indicates that just under 35% of adults lived in a household with a firearm in both 2014 and 2010. This represents a decline of over 16% from the peak average of 51.1% in 1976 to 1982. We have always been a nation of gun owners. Leftist media would have you think that gun ownership is way up and that the gun issue is the new phenomenon, but it's not. Even leftist researchers have to admit, based on empirical data, that gun ownership is down significantly since the 70s and the 80s. But during this very same period that we've seen a marked decrease in gun ownership, mass shootings on soft targets are way up. Instead of becoming apoplectic about gun ownership, which is clearly not the cause of mass shootings, we need to be reviewing other widespread cultural changes that have happened in the last 10 to 20 years that may have had an influence on these shootings. I want to discuss the characteristics of some of the most infamous mass shooters in American history. I reviewed this list of the worst mass shootings since 1949 in terms of fatalities and really dug into the childhood, family, relationships, especially with women, social behavior, and the triggering events for the worst shootings that we've seen. For the sake of time, because I already know this is going to be a very long video, I'm only going to be discussing the shootings with the most fatalities. So some of the more notorious shootings like Columbine and James Holmes won't be discussed, although mental health issues, father absence, and other things like that I will talk about later were almost certainly factors in these shootings as well. I also won't be discussing the shootings perpetrated by Muslims. We know that Islamic attacks largely stem from religious zealotry and hatred of the West. Islamic terrorism poses a different set of challenges that needs a different set of solutions. I do, of course, want to qualify this before I start. I'm not saying that psychotropic drugs are the direct cause of mass shootings, and I'm not saying that these people aren't evil. I'm not trying to paint them as sympathetic characters or portray them as more than they really were. I'm trying to see the commonality so that we can remedy the deeper cultural problem. Some of these people were stone-cold psychopaths, likely from birth. Adam Lanza was showing antisocial and some violent tendencies even since the age of 2 and 3. There is clearly a genetic component here, but in all of these cases, as you will see, there has been a multifactorial effort and multiple failures on the part of people surrounding the perpetrator that, if dealt with better, perhaps could have prevented the shootings. The worst shooting in American history happened in November in Las Vegas. 58 people were killed, and even though there is still so much mystery surrounding this shooting, we do know quite a bit about the shooter, Stephen Paddock. Stephen Paddock had a pretty terrible childhood, which is nearly a universal theme in mass shooters. He was born to horribly irresponsible parents. His father, Benjamin Paddock, was accused of robbing a Phoenix bank in 1960 and was captured in Las Vegas after fleeing Arizona. He later escaped prison and landed on the FBI's most wanted list. But before he became a famous failed bank robber wanted by the FBI, he managed to find a woman to marry him. Stephen Paddock's mother married his father in 1952. In 1946, he was convicted of 10 counts of larceny and was in jail until 1951, the year before he married. He was in and out of their lives, beat all of the boys and their mother, and she still had 4 sons with him, knowing, before she had the first, that he was a seasoned, abusive criminal. She also knew before their marriage that he was a compulsive gambler, a real winner. And of course, with a father in and out of the house, we don't know what kind of men the mother was bringing around her sons. This seems like the kind of situation where there could have been sexual abuse, especially in light of the revelation that one of the brothers is a pedophile. Bruce Paddock was arrested in LA on suspicion of possessing child pornography, over 600 images, many of children younger than 12. He was also banned from a nursing home in California after he reportedly screamed at and threatened to kill the staff there. And some of the addictive tendencies carried through to the children. Stephen Paddock ended up being a compulsive gambler just like his father. It was like his job. He seemed to be fairly antisocial even though he had a girlfriend and was twice divorced, and periodically would engage in social activities. He was described as a loner, but managed to keep these codependent women around him most of his life. There were a few accounts of his publicly berating his girlfriend, things like that. Another of his brothers said, "Something happened that drove him into the pit of hell. No affiliation, no religion, no politics. He never cared about any of that stuff." He didn't seem to have a long history of mental health issues, but was experiencing some anxiety, so he was prescribed Valium in the June before the shooting. Stephen Paddock is the type of shooter that is going to be the most difficult to prevent. He had no criminal record, he appeared sane, and his verbal abuse would fall more under the category of him just being a dick rather than a potential murderer. His mental health issues at the time seemed trivial, just some anxiety and a low dose of Valium. He didn't have a history of psychosis or anything like that. Like many of the people I'm going to discuss, this was a perfect storm. Some mental health issues likely at play, a childhood filled with abandonment and abuse, and like his brother suggests, a triggering event. We're 3 months out and we still know so little about this, but what we do know about him and his childhood is mostly consistent with the other mass shooters. Seung-Hui Cho shot and killed 32 people on Virginia Tech's campus in 2007. The mass murder ended when he turned the gun and shot himself in the head. He was born in South Korea and immigrated to Virginia when he was just 8. He had a lot of problems adjusting, picked on by other students starting at a young age, and was later described by his teachers as a trouble loner. From what I can tell, his family seems like they were a pretty typical Korean family. They were not particularly emotionally open, although when he began expressing signs of mental illness, his mother sought psychotherapy, despite the stigma in the Korean community. His mother and father really did try to deal with his mental health issues, how withdrawn he had become, how erratic his behavior was, but he insisted upon leaving for college against their wishes. Shortly after he arrived, he wrote a suicide-type note to a suite mate, which led to him being taken to a psychiatric hospital. He was released pretty quickly with orders to receive therapy as an outpatient, but he attended just one court-ordered session afterwards. Like most of these shooters, he had issues with women. He was twice accused of stalking female students in 2005. He also was caught photographing the legs and knees of female students in his classes. I think that his parents likely did not understand the depths of his mental illness. I read his manifesto yesterday, and it is largely incoherent and rambling. I linked it below if you want to read it. He does appear to have some sort of savior complex, though, and disdain for Christians. He sent his manifesto to NBC before the murders. "You sadistic snobs, I may be nothing but a piece of dog shit. You have vandalized my heart, raped my soul, and torched my conscience again and again. You thought it was one pathetic, void life that you were extinguishing. Thanks to you, I die, like Jesus Christ, to inspire generations of the weak and defenseless people, my brothers, sisters, and children, that you fuck." Unlike Paddock, Cho had a clear history of much more serious mental health issues, and he entertained grandiose delusions about his moral character and how through these murders he's actually a protector of the weak and defenseless. But both were loners that harbored disdain and aggression for women, and they felt like they were persecuted outcasts. So did Adam Lanza. On December 14, 2012, Nancy Lanza was shot dead by her son, who then killed 26 more people during a rampage at Sandy Hook Elementary School. Of all of the mass shooters that I researched for this presentation, Adam Lanza is the one that had the most clearly expressed psychiatric conditions, even very early in his life. By age 3, he had clear developmental issues, including communication and sensory difficulties, socialization delays, and he had already started compulsively repeating behaviors. They appeared to be getting better until his parents separated in 2002. Lanza was described by some as seeming happy, smiling, and participating in community and school activities. At the same time, however, more red flags for developmental and mental health concerns remained or emerged. Lanza began perseverative hand-washing, avoiding eye contact with other people, and becoming increasingly fearful. By 5th grade, which was the year that his parents separated, Adam had written and submitted the Big Book of Granny, a significant and violent text, and following that school year, his struggles began to escalate. He was diagnosed with Asperger's and a sensory perception disorder that prevented him from recognizing pain and caused him to recoil from being touched. His mother and grandfather had an autoimmune disorder that was pretty baffling to doctors, but the illness caused lesions to form on his mother's brain. She hid the genetic nature of this disease from her son Adam. He was prescribed anti-anxiety drugs, one of which caused him to have a severe reaction. After that, he refused medication. Specialists noted that he was delusional, but they did not recognize his delusions as signs of schizophrenia. His father believes to this day that Adam was an undiagnosed schizophrenic. Adam's mental illness became so bad that he had to be withdrawn from school and be homeschooled. Since his parents had separated, his mother's coddling went largely unchecked. Considering the murder, I think it's safe to assume that this made him hate and resent her. After her death, a Word document called Selfish was found on Adam's computer and is apparently a manifesto about women's inherent selfishness. So like the others, he had serious issues with women. Not only was he undesirable to women because of his mental health issues and his appearance, but he was also likely depressed by the codependent relationship with his mother and was totally delusional about his ability to make rational decisions on his own. He did not have a history of criminality, but like Cho, He expressed violence in his writing, was a social outcast, had a severe history of mental illness, and life changes like moving or going to school seemed to precipitate the respective event. Devin Patrick Kelly was much of the same. He was a member of the Air Force. I've noticed a theme of military service in my research. Adam Lanza also wanted to join but couldn't for obvious reasons. I think this has to do with their weapons fixation, which we see across the board with mass shooters. Kelly is another one that, as far as I can tell, although it's hard to tell in these situations, did not seem to have a horribly dysfunctional upbringing. I did read accounts from people that went to high school with him that claimed that his father would go crazy if he messed up during a football game, but that's about all the information I could get. I did notice in some of the other cases that where there was not parental absence, there was often a demand for perfection paired with harsh physical discipline in the event of failure. He was kind of an average student, did okay, but got into some trouble and was subsequently diagnosed and treated for ADHD with a cocktail of psychiatric medication starting at around age 10 or 11. Fellow students say that he was an introvert who mostly kept to himself, and if he interacted with people, it was sort of because he was shifting in and out of groups of people casually. He later was described as an obsessed atheist who was really vocal about it and his love for guns on social media. But even in high school, he showed serious disdain for women. Female classmates said that he would shove them and grope them in the hallway. Kelly was court-martialed in 2012 for assault on his spouse and on her child. He received a bad conduct discharge. His wife divorced him during his confinement. Then he remarried and continued to abuse his second wife, of course. After his court-martial, he escaped from a mental health clinic. In the police report related to this incident, it stated that he had attempted to sneak weapons onto the airbase and carry out death threats against his chain of command. But whoops, the Air Force failed to enter Kelly's criminal history into a federal database, which would have precluded him from gun ownership. This case is particularly sad because we didn't really have to predict that this guy was going to do this. We had already, and if our government was not inefficient because of layers of bureaucracy, existing laws could be enforced. But we have the same thing going on as we did with the others. Inability to have normal relationships with women, which causes resentment and abuse. Mental illness treated with drugs from a young age, obsession with weapons, socially withdrawn, same thing. The 1991 Luby's massacre occurred when George Hennard drove his truck through the front window of a Texas restaurant, then shot and killed 23 people, wounded 27 others. He had a shootout with the police, refused to surrender, then shot himself. Hennard was born to an accomplished surgeon and a high-strung, domineering homemaker mother. I couldn't get much information on his childhood, but his parents stayed together until he was in his late 20s. It was not a stable childhood still because the family and their 4 children moved a dozen times from base to base to base. At some point, George had a terrible confrontation with his father and he was forever changed. He was combative from then on, ultimately escaping by joining the Navy. He had always hated his mother, so there was really no reason to stay. Neighbors and those that knew him also have stated that he had an evident problem with women for some reason. Hennard stalked 2 sisters who lived in his neighborhood prior to the massacre, sent them creepy and threatening letters about women being treacherous vipers. During the attack, he was screaming about female duplicity and was skipping over men to shoot and kill women. According to his sister, losing his job was one of the triggers for the massacre. She said that another trigger was the news of Anita Hill accusing Clarence Thomas of sexual harassment. He is said to have screamed at the TV, "You dumb bitch, you bastards open the door for all women." Hennard was more like Paddock than like Cho, Lanza, or Kelly. He didn't appear psychotic in the meaningful sense of the word. Like Paddock, to others, he would just appear to be a real dick and a misogynist, not a potential murderer. He couldn't form meaningful relationships, couldn't keep a job because he was so unpleasant and rude. But then again, like Lanza, he did have an overbearing mother that he hated. He was a loner, and he was a young-ish man that felt betrayed by society and by women. Apparently, another of the triggering factors was that he had just turned 35 and he was taking it very hard. Perhaps he realized that he was never going to have success with women and that he's no longer a young man, but I'm just speculating based on the account of his sister. James Huberty is another with a similar story, although he was on the older side at the time of the shooting, 41. He shot up a San Diego McDonald's in 1984, killing 21, injuring 19, before being fatally shot by a SWAT sniper. As a child, he contracted polio, so he was weak into his adulthood and had a hard time walking. When he was 10, his father bought a farm in Amish country, but his mother did not want to move, so she abandoned the family to become a sidewalk preacher. His father then married a young school teacher with children of her own, and he hated her. So here we have maternal abandonment of a child that had been very sick. This must have been a deep betrayal and sadness for him that I'm sure he kept with him his whole life. He became a mortician, which is another dark obsession, like the writings and drawings we discussed earlier and the weapons fixation, then got married and had kids. Like the others, he was very physically abusive to his wife and children. His pastor commented on his behavior. With him, you always felt a little uneasy about the way he harbored something inside. He was pent up, he was a loner, and he had kind of an explosive personality. 3 days before the shooting, he told his wife that he was having a mental problem. The day before the shooting, he called a mental health clinic requesting an appointment. He waited by the phone for hours for a call back, but because they had written his last name down incorrectly, they never made contact. The next day, the family did ordinary things. He said cryptically to his wife that day at the San Diego Zoo, "Well, society had their chance," presumably referring to the mental health clinic's failure to respond to his appointment request. Like most of the other mass shooters, he had a triggering event in the form of losing his job due to a plant closing. Also, like the others, he had a weapons obsession. He was a prepper, but it went deep into the realm of paranoia. He viewed all other people as a threat, which probably stemmed from his abandonment issues and just growing up with a physical defect. And of course, he was a mentally ill loner, physically unattractive and weak, who hated women because of issues with his mother and was abusive to those that remained in his life. Charles Whitman, the Texas Tower sniper, despite being strong and handsome, which is uncharacteristic of mass shooters, largely followed the same pattern. In 1966, he stabbed his mother and wife to death, then went to the University of Texas where he started his rampage. After killing a few, he went to the tower's 28th floor and continued until he was shot by police. 16 people were killed, 31 were injured. His childhood will sound very familiar to you. His father, who was raised in an orphanage, was a stern, authoritarian, self-made man. The wife he took was just 17 and was not equipped to be a mother. Additionally, from the very beginning, there was domestic violence in the marriage. Charles' father demanded perfection of the entire family, lest they be beat mercilessly. After being beaten by his father for coming home drunk as a teenager, he secretly enlisted in the Marines. He developed a reputation for being an exemplary Marine, but he had a gambling problem, and eventually he was court-martialed for gambling, possession of a personal firearm on base, and for making threats to another Marine. He was subsequently demoted. Charles carried the pattern of domestic abuse into his own relationship like most of the others. He was afraid of being like his father, but he still beat his wife, then would feel horribly guilty about it. This cognitive dissonance manifested itself in their murders as well. Like Cho, he had a bit of a savior complex. He thought he was helping at least his wife and mother. Of his mother, he said that he was, quote, "truly sorry that this was the only way I could see to relieve her sufferings, but I think it was best." And after stabbing his wife to death while she slept, he stated in a note that, "I love her dearly. I cannot rationally pinpoint any specific reason for doing this." Like the others, Charles Whitman was plagued with mental illness. He had visited several university doctors in the year before the shooting. They too prescribed various medications to him. He was on a cocktail of medications as well, but it did include Valium, which we've seen in other mass shootings. Whitman met with the staff psychiatrist at the University of Texas 4 months before the shooting. He references this in his suicide note. "I talked with the doctor once for about 2 hours and tried to convey to him my fears that I felt overcome with overwhelmingly violent impulses. After one visit, I never saw the doctor again, and since then have been fighting my mental turmoil alone and seemingly to no avail. After my death, I wish that an autopsy would be performed on me to see if there is any visible physical disorder." The doctor's notes from the visit said, "This massive muscular youth seemed to be oozing with hostility, that something seemed to be happening to him and that he didn't seem to be himself. He readily admits having overwhelming periods of hostility with a very minimum of provocation. Repeated inquiries attempting to analyze his exact experiences were not too successful with the exception of his vivid reference to, quote, thinking about going up on the tower with a deer rifle and start shooting people." Here's another situation where the person was transparent about their intentions and actually sought help. Perhaps, like Cho or Lanza or Huberty, this could have been prevented through involuntary institutionalization. Hell, I bet some of them would have been voluntarily committed. 2 of them sought out mental health professionals immediately prior to the massacres. I wanted to talk about Nicholas Cruz last because it is the freshest in our memories, and like the 3 other cases that I've already discussed, there was an institutional failure whereby the opportunity to prevent the massacre was lost due to fateful bureaucratic fumbles. In this case, the FBI being a useless organization that can't do a basic follow-up. Nicholas Cruz was abandoned by his birth mother and was adopted shortly after birth with his younger brother, 2, by all accounts, loving older parents. His adoptive father died when he was 6. This would probably be perceived by him as the second abandonment in his life. Then he and his brother were raised by an overwhelmed older mother that was having a really hard time coping with her adopted son who had serious mental health issues. She died about 3 months ago from the flu, which was likely part of the triggering event for the Florida school shooting, which killed 17. The cops were called on him 39 times, sometimes for trying to kill animals and for other violent and self destructive behavior. The incident reports, which are as recent as September 2016, describe Cruz as suffering from mental illness and being emotionally handicapped and being on behavioral medication. One notes, he has mentioned in the past that he would like to purchase a firearm. The documents include more than 30 reports going back as far as 2011, covering misbehavior by Cruz and some by his younger brother. They add further depth to the emerging portrait of Cruz as an unstable teen who had long been on the radar of law enforcement, behavioral specialists, teachers, and fellow students. He was also on a cocktail of prescription medication. He had been diagnosed with ADHD for his developmental issues and learning disabilities. Additionally, like all of the others, he was abusive towards women. He stalked a student and threatened others. He had recently been dumped and was harassing his ex-girlfriend. But otherwise, again, he had an antagonistic, antisocial personality and could not maintain friendships or successfully enter sexual relationships. People thought that he was strange, that something was not right about him, that he was cold, soulless, and we've heard the same things about the others. And he too had a dark obsession with death, mutilation, violence. The similarities in the cases that we've discussed are striking. Nearly all of the shooters had known mental health issues and had exhibited serious violent tendencies that predated the event. Nearly all were abusive to women, and many had a long and documented history of violence and stalking. Most were on a cocktail of prescription medications. At least 3 were on Valium or other anti-anxiety medication, and at least 3 were on Ritalin or Adderall. Most had rough childhoods that included abuse and at least one absent parent. Where the parents were present, there was a tendency to demand perfection, which was usually accompanied by physical abuse. Most of the shootings that I've discussed have happened since the year 2007, and only 2 occurred before the 90s. We have a clear, measurable uptick in this kind of event in the last decade, and it behooves us to look at the commonalities between the shooters and to evaluate what has changed in our society in the last 10 to 20 years that may be contributing to this problem. We've discussed psychotropic drugs, parental absence and abuse, and the role of mental health, but what else has changed? I'm not going to sit here and give the violent video games argument, but there is something to be said about living in a society where all images are instantly accessible. It allows those with dark tendencies to indulge them anonymously in an unprecedented way. I don't know what kind of effect this is having on children, but I'd imagine that it's negative. In terms of educational changes in the last 10 to 20 years, we've seen curriculum become increasingly feminized, as well as the nature of the classroom. I don't believe that most people diagnosed with ADD really have it. I'm not really sure that it's even a legitimate diagnosis. I think we're seeing a lot of young boys with normal levels of activity being punished for not being able to sit politely like little girls can. Boys need to be rough and tumble and to play it out until they're tired. It really seems like female teachers are telling parents that their boys are hyperactive when really they have a normal activity level, and they're being put on a very heavy dose of amphetamines at a very young age, which lessens the burden on the teacher to control the classroom. For the students that do have legitimate mental health issues, which it is likely that all the shooters that I discussed did, we used to live in communities with stable families that would pull together to provide help for lost young men. Look at the commonalities between the shooters we discussed: parental abandonment, unstable childhood, no strong male guidance. And when communities used to see something going wrong with a child, they did something and cared about what happened because it affected their community. With so many of these cases, it was fairly obvious that the event was going to take place. There were signs. Sometimes they told people what they were going to do. But we have this attitude now like we don't care what happens as long as it doesn't affect us. We just can't be bothered. We need to bring back psychiatric hospitals. This was one of Reagan's greatest failings. Deinstitutionalizing the violently mentally ill was bad enough, but now we can't even institutionalize those that desperately need it. This likely would have prevented at least 4 of the shootings that I've discussed. We need to look at and understand the profile of the mass shooter so that we, as a society, can stop this. Western civilization has cracks. It is failing. In a failing society where the chaos brews just below the surface, sane, rational people will remain strong until everything comes undone. But in those beginning stages of the fall, the first people that fall apart and go crazy are those with mental illness and violent tendencies. How many of these shooters were suspicious, paranoid loners that resented the way society had treated them and the direction that it had gone? They had no hope for the future, and they only had disdain for their fellow man. So long as our society is broken and we lack cohesion and community, these incidents will occur with increasing frequency. This isn't about guns. Cho used handguns, and we aren't going to give up our guns because of school shootings. That will cause a civil war. This is about the deeper cultural issues that are manifesting in this type of mass murder. Unless we correct them, this will always be a part of our society. Let me know what you think in the comments section. What needs to be done to prevent mass shootings? Thanks, folks, and I'll see you soon. Bye.